Pride and Prejudice is an 1813 novel of manners written by Jane Austen. The novel follows the character development of Elizabeth Bennet, the dynamic protagonist of the book who learns about the repercussions of hasty judgments and comes to appreciate the difference between superficial goodness and actual goodness. Mr. Bennet, owner of the Longbourn estate in Hertfordshire, has 5 daughters, but his property is entailed and can only be passed to a male heir. His wife also lacks an inheritance, so his family faces becoming very poor upon his death. Thus, it is imperative that at least one of the girls marry well to support the others, which is a motivation that drives the plot. In rural England in the early 19th century, Mrs. Bennet attempts to persuade Mr. Bennet to visit Mr. Bingley, a rich bachelor who recently arrived in the neighborhood. After some verbal sparring with her husband, Mrs. Bennet believes he will not call on Mr. Bingley. Shortly afterwards, he visits Netherfield, Mr. Bingley's rented residence, much to Mrs. Bennet's delight. The visit is followed by a ball at the local assembly rooms that the entire neighborhood attends. At the ball, the neighborhood is introduced to the whole Netherfield party, which consists of Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, the husband of one of his sisters, and Mr. Darcy, his dearest friend. Mr. Bingley's friendly and cheerful manner earns him popularity among the guests. He appears attracted to Jane Bennet, the eldest Bennet daughter, with whom he dances twice. Mr. Darcy, reputed to be twice as wealthy, is haughty and aloof, causing a decided dislike of him. He declines to dance with Elizabeth, the second eldest Bennet daughter, stating that she is not attractive enough to tempt him. Elizabeth finds this amusing and jokes about it with her friends. Mr. Bingley's sisters, Caroline and Louisa, later invite Jane to Netherfield for dinner. On her way there, Jane is caught in a rain shower and develops a bad cold, forcing her to stay at Netherfield to recuperate, much to Mrs. Bennet's delight. When Elizabeth goes to see Jane, Mr. Darcy finds himself attracted to Elizabeth, stating she has fine eyes, while Miss Bingley grows jealous, as she herself has designs on Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth herself is indifferent and unaware of his developing interest in her. Mr. Collins, Mr. Bennet's cousin and the heir to the Longbourn estate, visits the Bennet family. He's a pompous, obsequious clergyman who intends to marry one of the Bennet girls. After learning that Jane may soon be engaged, he quickly decides on Elizabeth, the next daughter in both age and beauty. Elizabeth and her family meet the dashing and charming army officer, George Wickham, who singles out Elizabeth. He says he's connected to the Darcy family and claims Mr. Darcy deprived him of a living, a permanent position as a clergyman, promised to him by Mr. Darcy's late father. Elizabeth's dislike of Mr. Darcy is confirmed. At a subsequent ball at Netherfield, Mr. Darcy asks Elizabeth to dance, and, despite her vow never to dance with him, she accepts. However, Elizabeth's mother and younger sisters display a distinct lack of decorum. Mrs. Bennet hints loudly that she fully expects Jane and Bingley to become engaged, and the younger Bennet sisters expose the family to ridicule by their silliness. Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth. She rejects Collins, to her mother's fury and her father's relief. After Elizabeth's rejection, Mr. Collins proposes to Charlotte Lucas, a sensible young woman and Elizabeth's friend, who is already aged 27. Charlotte is grateful for a proposal that guarantees her a comfortable home and a secure future. Elizabeth is aghast at such pragmatism in matters of love. Shortly afterward, the Bingleys suddenly depart for London with no plans to return, and it appears that Mr. Bingley has no intention of resuming their acquaintance. A heartbroken Jane visits her aunt and Uncle Gardner in London to raise her spirits. In the spring, Elizabeth visits Charlotte and Mr. Collins in Kent. Elizabeth and her hosts are invited to Rosings Park, the imposing home of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, imperious patroness of Mr. Collins and Mr. Darcy's wealthy aunt. Lady Catherine expects Mr. Darcy to marry her daughter, as planned in his childhood by his aunt and mother. Mr. Darcy and his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, are also visiting Rosings Park. Fitzwilliam tells Elizabeth how Mr. Darcy recently saved a friend, presumably Bingley, from an undesirable match. Elizabeth realizes that the prevented engagement was to Jane and is horrified that Mr. Darcy interfered. Later, Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth, declaring his love for her despite